Hello, we are back with Wayside School Gets a Little Stranger by Louis Sachar, or Sakar. I'm not sure. We are on chapter 14, a light bulb, a pencil sharpener, a coffee pot, and a sack of potatoes. Galileo was a great scientist, said Mrs. Drizzle. He was born in Italy in 1564 and died in 1642. He was the first person to use a telescope to study the stars, and he also helped figure out the laws of gravity. Oh, I know about gravity, said Joe. Mrs. Jules pushed a computer out of the window and it fell a lot faster than a pencil. I don't think so, said Mrs. Drizzle. Galileo proved that all objects fall at the same speed. He conducted a very famous experiment. He dropped lots of different objects off the Leaning Tower of Pisa. The Leaning Tower of Pisa is in Italy. It was built in... Todd raised his hand. You're getting a little boring, he said. Oh, my goodness, am I? Asked Mrs. Drizzle. Rondi, Leslie, Paul, and Calvin nodded their heads. I'm sorry, said Mrs. Drizzle, and she thought a moment. I know. Let's do the experiment here. The children cheered. They loved experiments. Mrs. Drizzle rubbed her hands together. Let's see. We'll need a coffee pot, a pencil sharpener, a light bulb, and we'll need something heavy. An elephant's heavy, said Benjamin. There are no elephants in Wayside School, said Mrs. Drizzle, and everyone laughed. How about a sack of potatoes, asked Ron. Bet Miss Mush has one. Go see, said Mrs. Drizzle. There's a coffee pot down in the office, said Stephen. Go get it, said Mrs. Drizzle. If I had a screwdriver, I could get the pencil sharpener off the wall, said Eric Fry. I've got a screwdriver, said Jenny. Can we use a fluorescent light bulb? Asked Bebe. She looked up at the ceiling. I guess so, said Mrs. Drizzle. How do I get it? Well, you're the scientist, said Mrs. Drizzle. You figure it out. Bebe put her chair up on top of her desk. Oh my gosh, do not ever do that. That is so dangerous. But she put her chair on top of her desk and she stood on it. And she still couldn't reach the ceiling. Hey, Benjamin, let me have your chair. So she put Benjamin's chair on top of hers, but she still wasn't tall enough. Oh my gosh. Calvin dumped the wastepaper basket onto the floor. Here, try this. Bebe turned the trash can upside down and put it on top of Benjamin's chair. Then she climbed on top, but she still couldn't quite reach. And then Leslie brought the class dictionary. Jenny and Dana donated their math books. Sherry grabbed Mrs. Drizzle's old blue notebook. Put that down, yelled Mrs. Drizzle, right now. Sherry dropped the notebook. Mrs. Drizzle's kindly old face had suddenly turned mean. Don't ever touch that again, Mrs. Drizzle ordered. Sherry returned to her desk, trembling. Everyone was staring at Mrs. Drizzle. She smiled sweetly. Go back to what you were doing, she said. Jason threw Bebe his lunchbox. She set it on top of the books and climbed on top. Standing on her tiptoes, she was able to pull the cover off the fluorescent light, and she grabbed the light just as the pile collapsed beneath her. She fell to the ground, triumphantly holding the unbroken light bulb high above her head. Ron returned with a sack of potatoes from Miss Mush. Stephen returned with Mr. Kidswatter's coffee pot. Oh no. Eric Fry unscrewed the pencil sharpener from the wall. Mrs. Drizzle wrote coffee pot, sack of potatoes, pencil sharpener, and light bulb on the blackboard. We're going to drop all 4 objects out the windows at the same time. How many people think the coffee pot will hit the ground first? Is there coffee in it? Asked John. It's about half full, Stephen reported. 8 kids thought the coffee pot would hit the ground first. 16 thought the sack of potatoes would hit the ground first. 3 thought the light bulb would be first, and only Terrence thought that the pencil sharpener would hit first. Jason, Jenny, Joe, John, and Joy were the judges. Mrs. Drizzle sent them outside. Stephen held the coffee pot out one window, Phoebe held the light bulb out another, Eric Fry had the pencil sharpener out another, and Ron held out the sack of potatoes. Everyone else crowded around to watch. With everyone on the same side of the classroom, the school leaned a little bit, just like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. On your mark, get set, let go, said Mrs. Drizzle. The objects fell through the air and smashed against the pavement. A short while later, the judges returned. Their clothes were spattered with coffee. Jenny had bits of potatoes in her hair. Was the pencil sharpener first? Asked Terence. It happened so fast, said Joe. They all hit about the same time. But the coffee pot made the coolest explosion, said Jason. I think the light bulb hit the ground last, said John. Well, that's possible, said Mrs. Drizzle. Gravity causes all objects to fall at the same rate. But air slows them down. That's called air resistance, and that's good. Otherwise, raindrops would kill us. Air resistance slows all things down a little bit, but it has a greater effect on very light objects, such as a piece of paper. And of course, the shape of the paper is important too. A crumpled up piece of paper will fall faster than... You're getting boring again, said Mac. Mrs. Drizzle stopped talking. Now we need a new pencil sharpener, said Leslie. Paul licked her ear. Chapter 15. An Elephant in Wayside School. The bell rang for recess and the children exploded out of the building. Lewis, the yard teacher, was ready with a big pile of red and green balls. The kids called, "Hi, Lewis!" and "Over here, Lewis!" as he tossed the balls to them. Over his shoulder, behind his back, through his legs. Dee Dee came charging out of the building. Usually by this time she got to the playground. There were no good balls left, but she could see one red ball by Lewis's foot. She knocked over a kid from the 10th floor and shouted, "Hey, Lou!" And suddenly, she had just remembered where she'd heard of Mrs. Drizzle. It was from Lewis. He had once told her about the meanest teacher he'd ever had when he was a kid, and she hurried over to her friends to make sure. "Hey, Todd," she called. Todd was playing tetherball with Ron, and as he turned to look at Dee Dee, the ball came around and bonked him on the head. "Hey, do you remember when Lewis told us about the meanest teacher he ever had?" asked Dee Dee. Todd shook his head, and after being conked by the tetherball, he couldn't remember anything. "I remember," said Jason, who was in line to play. "Whenever Lewis got in trouble, the teacher used to put a waste paper basket on his head." "That's right," said Jenny, "and then Lewis would have to keep it there the rest of the day, and everyone would laugh at him. And then the teacher would call on him to answer questions from the blackboard, but he couldn't see the questions, so she'd give him an F." "Do you remember the teacher's name?" asked Dee Dee. Her friends shook their heads. Todd couldn't even remember his own name. "I think it was Mrs. Drizzle," said Dee Dee. They ran to Lewis. "Hey, Lewis," said Jason, "what was the name of that mean teacher you once had when you were a kid?" He said, "Which one?" asked Lewis. "The one that put the trash can on your head," said Jenny. Lewis shuddered and just thinking about her. "Mrs. Drizzle," he whispered. The kids looked at each other. "What color hair did she have?" asked Jason. "Brown," said Lewis. "Why?" "We have a substitute teacher," explained Dee Dee, "and she's real nice." "Good." "Her name is Mrs. Drizzle," said Dee Dee. "Whoa, I'm getting out of here," said Lewis. He started to run, but the kids grabbed him. "It's okay. It can't be the same teacher. Our teacher is nice. And her hair isn't brown. It's white." Lewis relaxed a little bit. "You want to come up and meet her?" "No way," said Lewis. "Oh, you're so silly, Lewis," said Dee Dee. "She's not the same teacher, and besides, you're a teacher now, too." Oh, yeah, I forgot," said Lewis. "Come on, Lewis." Said Dee Dee. She held his hand and led him up the stairs, and they entered the classroom. Mrs. Drizzle was putting some of the children's work on the bulletin board. "Mrs. Drizzle, we brought our yard teacher up here to meet you." "Oh, it's very nice to meet you," said Mrs. Drizzle as she pinned up Joe's arithmetic test. "Exercise is so important for young minds and bodies." She turned around. Lewis's face paled. "Well, it was nice to meet you," he said very quickly. "Gotta go. Bye." "Stay right where you are, Lewis," ordered Mrs. Drizzle. He froze. Mrs. Drizzle slowly walked to her desk, and she picked up the old blue notebook. "The notebook," whispered Lewis. Mrs. Drizzle opened it and flipped through the pages. "Here we are," she said, and she removed a piece of paper and handed it to Lewis. "Is this your homework?" she asked. Lewis looked at it. "You were supposed to copy it over, weren't you?" asked Mrs. Drizzle. "That was over 15 years ago," said Lewis. "I don't remember." "I do," said Mrs. Drizzle. Oh, now I remember," said Lewis. "I was going to copy it over, but then my pencil point broke, so I went to sharpen it, but the pencil sharpener fell on my foot, so I had to go to the hospital." "I don't want any of your famous excuses, Lewis," said Mrs. Drizzle. "I just want the homework. You may share Dee Dee's desk." Lewis sat next to Dee Dee. "And remember, Lewis, I know your tricks." Dee Dee watched Lewis struggle with his homework. "Sorry, Lewis," she said. "Don't be sorry," said Mrs. Drizzle. "It's for his own good. And I expect neatness, Lewis, or else you'll have to do it again." He frowned. Mrs. Drizzle stood over him and watched him work. "Your fingernails are filthy," she said. "I'm the yard teacher," Lewis tried to explain. "I spend a lot of time outside, in the grass, dirt and stuff." "I don't want excuses," said Mrs. Drizzle. "I want clean fingernails, and while you're at it, shave off that mustache. It looks like a hairy caterpillar crawling across your face." "Not my mustache." "Unless you want me to rip it off for you," said Mrs. Drizzle. Dee Dee felt terrible. "I can't believe Mrs. Drizzle still remembers you after all this time," she said. "An elephant never forgets," muttered Lewis. "I heard that," said Mrs. Drizzle, and she promptly put the wastebasket on top of Lewis's head. We will stop there.